Welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. It's great to have you back with us. From now on, we'll be moving on to things that aren't related necessarily to issues that pop up from time to time in the Middle East, but we will come back to subjects associated with that. But there are so many things going on in the world at the moment that, our mandate is to really tackle as many of those as we can, particularly where they have levels of complexity that really need unpacking. So today we're going to begin our conversations around the Russian-Ukraine war. Obviously, we've had a good couple of years, an ongoing situation there, which is tremendously distressing as well. Lots of civilian suffering and destruction. But one of the interesting dynamics of this is that we're dealing with, in the form of the leader of Russia, a full-scale dictator at present time. And his agendas need to be understood. His historical referencing needs to be unpacked and tested. And he really launched his version of Mein Kampf, I guess, in July of 2021 with an essay which dealt specifically with Russia's relationship with the Ukraine, basically where he was signaling that he didn't regard the Ukraine as a separate nation, and then launched into a bit of a historical diatribe to try and underpin that assertion. So today we're going to go on a bit of a journey back through the history of Russia and Ukraine, not in depth, but enough to give you, I think, a feel for the background to both evaluate his assertions, but also to the war itself. And then later on, we'll start to talk a lot more detail about the war and about all of the things that we have learned from that war and where things are going in the future. So this history of Russia and Ukraine, we're taking that right back to what we know from ancient times. And effectively what we're going to be looking at is the development of the Slavic tribes coming into the Ukraine area to begin with. They gave Ukraine a lot of its early characteristics, and the genetic and other cultural pull-throughs from that time are still there from that Slavic presence. And certainly it had a major influence on creating the population and dynamics and culture of the Ukraine region in its early days. An agricultural society that was really focused on a lots of the sort of dynamics we saw in those early times of cottage industries and trade amongst neighbouring villages, etc., but nothing that you could describe as a geopolitical entity, really based on the dynamics flowing from the management of individual villages. But that Slavic heritage is very important. Really, it's more important to kind of fast track through to the formation of what was called the Kievan Rus. So this is when you first get a look at something that you might describe as a state or a geopolitical entity. And in fact, Kievan Rus, which really evolved in the 9th century, was the first significant political entity in Eastern Europe. The first sort of entity you could claim was kind of like a state or a principality or collection of them that might mirror the sort of things you were seeing in Europe evolving at the time. And Kievan Rus, obviously you're seeing the influence of the migration and movements of the Rus, who it is believed really were descendants of the Norsemen, particularly perhaps from Sweden, that ventured out into the regions of what would become Russia and the Ukraine, following the river systems, in particular the major river systems like the Volga. And so you start seeing this mixture now of Rus and Slavs in this area, but a really distinct evolution of a geopolitical entity that actually precedes the formation of the Russian communities and entities that would be centered more around Moscow and further to the east. So in effect, Ukraine, in this sense, precedes the Russian states. So it was effectively a loose federation, but a lot of European entities and arrangements sort of matched this kind of construct back in the 9th century. But it was quite a powerful federation at the time, and it was operated under a central authority. So it has the characteristics of what we would come to know as states. Another then very significant formation of the character of the Ukraine became the invasion from the Mongol hordes who swept through this area in the 13th century in various phases. So initially, in the early years of the 13th century, probing and attacking the Kievan Rus, defeating them in a couple of major battles, and then coming back in about 1235 to complete the mission of seizing Kyiv, for example, and sacking it, and then further incursions and expansion in the area of the Ukraine over subsequent years and decades. And then the Mongol hordes tended to then move more into Central Europe and head north in their expansion phases. So at this point in time, it's about a 2 centuries influence and occupation of the area of Ukraine by Mongol regimes and administrations, and of course intermarriage that takes place then. So building on a Slavic and Rus heritage, you now start to see the Mongolian influence coming into the area of the Ukraine, which didn't really impact on the area that was to become Russia, centered on Moscow, and it in this period starts to evolve in as well and become a political power that would create another dynamic in competition with the Mongols and other influences emerging from the east and from southern Europe, the Caucasus, etc., and around the Crimea. So the long-term effects, obviously, it really significantly influenced, having been in existence in the Ukraine area for a couple of centuries. You would expect this, but of course the development of Kievan Rus and Moscow are shaped by these dynamics created by the Mongol influences in their expansion. So then we start to see the rise of what would become the Russian state, specifically in the 14th century, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, really the first entity that operates in a unified and powerful construct, and starts to lay the foundations for its expansion and for later unification of a Russian entity. And so you start to see that coming together from all the principalities that became part of the Grand Duchy. And again, mirroring what happened in the Kievan Rus state, you start to see the centrality of the organization and that governance as well. So Russian influence mainly formed from the basis of that Rus identity, that heritage, centered on that, starts to expand, particularly eastwards, but looking towards the west as well. And then, Kievan Rus and post-Mongol period has really developed into a conglomeration that was known during the 16th and 17th centuries as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it was a mix of various states, which I'll show you shortly on the map, of Belarus and Poland and Baltic states and what became Ukraine. So that region became quite a powerful entity as well. And there were various conflicts that were generated around that while it was asserting its territorial claims in the region, and it's clashing with other states that were also looking to expand or develop and threaten the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So the outcomes of the conflicts that occurred at that time had a lot of lasting effects on people's identity, culturally, and as that was passed through the centuries, and the dynamics that were then to later evolve and occur between particularly Russia, the Baltic states, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. So this is what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth looked like. Very sizable slice of Eastern Europe, the dominant component and element of Eastern Europe at the time. And Ukraine was a prominent part of that. But from this point on, you start to see more of an assertion of a specific Ukrainian entity from that kind of construct and separate to a Russian or Grand Duchy of Moscow type construct. And it was largely centered on the ethnic Cossack base at this time. The Cossacks, of course, are quite familiar to a lot of people as being a community, a society that sort of valued military prowess and the horse culture with that. And Cossacks became a bit of a constant theme in military exploits and in contests, both within the Russian context, but also more broadly in the expansion phases of the Russian Empire and other situations. So originally what was called the Hetmanate was a Cossack regime in this period, and it started out as being a semi-autonomous region within that construct of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but then really became quite assertive as a separate entity, but also a later symbol of the independence of Ukraine. And we start to see now very distinct evolution of a separate language in Ukraine, very separate from the Russian language, although it has some, joint connections and similarities. But at this point, you're starting to see this evolution of separation in language. So this is what the Cossack state looked like at that period of time, in that period of the 17th century, and other areas that remained in flux as the Cossack regime attempted to expand into other areas. You'll see Zaporizhia here, which people will maybe recognize that term in reference to the current war, a lot of fighting and activity and issues related to Zaporizhia. And you can see the Crimea there, that was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and later to become part of the conquests of the Russian Empire, and then in dispute between Russia and Ukraine, but at this point part of the Ottoman Empire. So, but this period's important because it really starts to set the identity of a separate nation of Ukrainians with their own language and culture and cultural references. Of course, then becomes the dynamic of digestion of a really dynamic and expanding Russian Empire. And it particularly begins in the 16th century, moving into then upscaling largely and dramatically during the 17th and then 18th centuries. And effectively, a lot of that was driven by the reign of Peter the Great, which was the later years of the 17th century into the first quarter of the 18th century. And so he was involved in several very impactful and important conflicts, mainly in particular in relation to battling Charles XII from Sweden and the famous Battle of Poltava, where that issue was resolved once and for all. But that really gave Peter the Great the platform for his further expansions. And you can see that period of expansion that straddles both his reign and then the following reign of Catherine the Great, who reigned right through effectively the 18th century and really becomes the linkage point towards what then happened in the 19th century. So you can see the various additions to the Russian Empire that occurred during those phases and then built upon by Alexander I and Nicholas I, particularly their expansions to the east, the acquisitions of Siberia and areas that are around what was the northern parts of Manchuria at that time, and then, of course, consuming in the period that we're talking about with Peter the Great and the later consolidations of Catherine the Great, the Ukraine is then absorbed into the Russian Empire during that time. So the Ukraine separate state identity becomes subsumed in this broader Russian imperial expansion. It didn't always remain a passive sort of situation here, and sometimes there were tensions and dynamics around that. One of the most significant ones was the so-called Pugachev or Cossack rebellion, as Pugachev was a Cossack, and that rebellion overlapped from the areas of Ukraine into other areas of Russia. It became quite threatening to the Russian Empire at the time, and it really was like a peasants' revolt, and it stemmed from the grievances that emerged from the serf system, the forced and compulsory military service of peasants, etc. So, but a certain flavour of this rebellion was also the heritage and cultural and national identity of Ukraine as something that was specifically associated with the Cossack world and culture at the time. So this continues to preserve that kind of element of agitation and separation from a broader acceptance of the Russian Empire. So under imperial rule, though, this is where you start to see attempts to dispel, disperse, destroy that kind of separate identity within Ukraine. And so what we would call Russification. And so that was marked by a lot of very significant steps and measures to suppress the separate Ukrainian language as it had evolved, and to suppress and deny any kind of separate cultural identity. So that was a really significant and intentional policy during the phase of Russian imperial rule as it intensified into the 18th century and the 19th century. And then, moving into the 20th century, you see more exertions in relation to cultural suppression. And it's during that time, during the 19th and early 20th century, you start to see this national awakening again to create a separate state in Ukraine. A lot of calls and movements looking for autonomy and self-determination. So this is a very significant period where you start to see political agitation and organised political agitation around distinctly separating as a state, embracing a significant and distinct Ukrainian culture and language. So in World War I, of course, there was a lot of movement of borders as a consequence of World War I. A lot of influences and political influences that emerged from the fighting. But interestingly, there was kind of like a separate dynamic of that in World War I, in that Russia, because of the revolutions that were taking place in 1917, departed from the Allied cause at that point and entered into a treaty with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians at the time, which was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so during that treaty, the Ukrainians were encouraged by the Central European powers to pursue their independence, and certainly took that opportunity to do that. And so the Ukrainian People's Republic declared its independence on the 22nd of January and signed a separate treaty with the Central Powers on the 9th of February 1918. At that point, Russia actually recognized the independence of Ukraine as part of the treaty process when they originally signed it on the 3rd of March 1918. They would come back to that, of course, fairly soon afterwards. And at this point, of course, you've had the Russian Revolution and you've got the Soviets in charge centrally of Russia, but their authority does not run to the whole of Russia, and they would be merging into the Russian Civil War. Not long after this, so-called White Russians would be challenging their authority, and there would be a lengthy civil war that would occur where a lot of Russia was deeply contested, and the Soviet control of Russia shrank to quite a confined area around the areas of Moscow, etc., and then leading to reconquest of those territories. So this stage, Ukraine was beginning to sort of assert themselves as well, along with Poland and Belarus, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus, etc. So following the final defeat of the Central Powers, though, in November of 1918, the Soviets moved back into Ukraine specifically on the defeat of those Central European powers. So basically reneged on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was able to be ignored because of the defeat of the Central Europeans, and immediately reasserted that authority. Then, of course, Russia went to war with Poland, who really wanted to assert their independence, and they were keen to reclaim territory they claimed as part of the Russian Empire. And but as part of that period of great flux and civil war, the Soviet Union started to move towards creation of these Soviet socialist republics within the Soviet Empire. And there were good reasons for them doing that. One was to try and keep a lid on sort of separatist nationalist tendencies, but also it gave them extra clout when it came time after World War II to join the United Nations. and they had extra voting power because some of these Soviet Socialist republics were members of the UN in their own right separately. And the Ukrainian construct was part of that type of regime, so they were admitted to the UN as a separate country in effect, and that was created out of the Treaty of Riga in 1921. So you actually have formalization around the borders of what would become a Ukrainian state based on the designation of what this Soviet Socialist Republic was. So this gave real catalyst to, the settlement of borders and local administration. So this really gives you an idea of the formation of the Soviet Union from that period of 1917 to 1922 through the Civil War, and the Soviet Socialist Republics that became part of that. Then you had satellite states too that would become another part of what the Soviet Union's world and control looked like post-World War II through expansion at that point. So again, this is what it looked like from the periods of revolution through to Civil War. And the contraction into the areas around Moscow as part of that Bolshevik territory. There still remained elements of dispute. That was a foreign intervention that was involved as well. So effectively, after becoming a republic within the Soviet Union, they went through a period of pretty intense industrialization after that as well. Ukraine had always been a very, very major rural primary industry location in Europe. The soil there is intensely rich black soil known as black gold. And till today, of course, Ukraine is one of the foremost producers of wheat and export of wheat to the world, which became a point of contest during this war where Russians tried to impede that. But certainly very strong agricultural society with tremendous productive capability in that respect. It also became something of an object of desire for Adolf Hitler too in World War II because of that reason, but also their rapid industrialization created new dimensions later on of capability. But the most important factor out of that was because of the way the Soviets conducted that rapid industrialization, and also collectivization was attempted of the farming industry and the farming society of Ukraine. It had massive impacts, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it really did create huge grievance in the area of Ukraine, which fed, their desires and their grievances against Russians, against the Soviet Empire, but also their interest in creating a separate state. So that period of famine was as horrendous and intense and known to Ukrainians as the Holodomor, and that was the period between 1932 and 1933. And so, the loss of life is not fully known, but it's estimated that somewhere between 3.5 to 5 million people, and people were resorting to cannibalism, etc. There's been a lot of discussion about whether this amounted to a genocide, and certainly it's very hard to kind of really ascertain that properly. And of course, these policies that the Russians and Soviets imposed applied equally to other areas of the Soviet Union, and there was a famine that affected other areas of the Soviet Union as well. But its most intense impact was in Ukraine. And there's certainly a deliberate policy to try and, suborn and bring Ukrainian society to heel around their traditional cultural constructs around their farming world. So there was an element of intention around that aspect of it. But no one can deny the massive impact on Ukraine and the deep cultural memory and resentments that emerged from it. So, we'll troll forward quickly through to the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, both Russia and Ukraine suffered greatly during the German invasions of the Second World War. The Jewish population of Ukraine particularly decimated. There were a large number of them there because they were part of the Pale of Settlement that the Russian Empire maintained for Jews who weren't allowed to move or live beyond that. So millions of Jews in Eastern Europe were largely centered in either Poland or Ukraine as a reflection of that Pale of Settlement. So, of course, the Jewish population of Ukraine decimated in that context through the Holocaust, but more broadly through the ebb and flow of the Second World War and the intense battles that occurred around key sites in Ukraine created a lot of devastation in that respect as well. And also some tensions that were to manifest themselves later and give rise to some of Putin's allegations about Ukrainians being Nazis, because some Ukrainians were encouraged who were seeking independence to cooperate with the Germans at that time and actually volunteer for military service to fight against the Soviet Union. This is what Putin tries to surface and say is carried through to the Ukrainian construct as it is now, that it's run by Nazis, etc., which is ironic because President Zelensky himself comes from a Ukrainian Jewish background. He is a Ukrainian Jew, and his mother, and their family were survivors of the German invasion and the Holocaust. So anyway, that period after the war and the fall of the Soviet Union, if we track forward to that period under Gorbachev and the successors, really does then result in the full independence of Ukraine, which was declared in 1991, along with a number of former Soviet Socialist republics of the Soviet Union who now become independent. And obviously, there were significant challenges from that because Ukraine was a major location for Russian nuclear weapons. The Crimea was a really significant base for the Russian Navy on top of that, and a lot of assets that the Russians had deployed in Ukraine of various kinds. Then there had to be a way carved out of how do you resolve that issue, and various efforts were made to find ways to remove nuclear weapons from Ukraine, make them, and they were very keen not to be a nuclear power in any event, so ways forward were found on that, and certain guarantees were given to them as a result of that process, subsequently broken by Putin's Russia. So the problem, though, with the early days of independence of Ukraine is they're plagued by a lot of the things that happened in the early days of a new country. Corruption has been a significant challenge in Ukraine's post-independence political world. Those issues, have not been completely resolved, but they have made a lot of progress in that respect. And a lot of it was actually driven by the relationships still existing between Russia and certain Ukrainian personalities and individuals, etc. And people who became involved in the industrial Sovietization of Ukrainian industry. But the instability that sort of resulted from independence was quite significant. And a lot of it sort of then started to motivate the citizens to want better, to become part of the EU, to remove all of these vestiges of the old Soviet world and to democratize. And they wanted a quality of life that matched the West effectively and looked very much to the West rather than to Russia in that respect. And Putin very much saw that trend occurring and was very alarmed by it. So setting up a stable democracy became the core challenge, and there was a lot that meant you had really close and involved dynamics between the broader citizenry and the various issues that were emerging in their governance. So that's really the background to the history of where we got to with Russia prior to the confrontations directly with Vladimir Putin. So we'll end the show this week from that basis, and then what we'll do is we'll start next week to talk in more detail about Vladimir Putin and about the evolution of the circumstances that preceded the actual outbreak of war. So thanks for being with me. Look forward to talking to you more next week. Cheers.